All right. In this video, we are going to dive into language objectives. We'll talk about, again, what they are and why they matter. And then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of how to actually write a language objective. And a metaphor I like to use when talking about language objectives is this one, the water in the fishbowl, because I think it's very true that, especially for those of us who have grown up speaking English and using English as part of our everyday lives since birth, it can sometimes be hard to understand what is so difficult about language. If you just grow up in the water of English, and you don't see the water. There's an expression that fish are often the last ones to discover water. And I think it's also true that those of us who grow up in the dominant language of a society that is the language of schooling often don't see what's so hard about the language because it's just always been around us. That's where I think if you're a bilingual or multilingual teacher, if you're somebody who grew up speaking a language other than English, I think you have an advantage in that you probably are more attuned to the types of challenges that our multilingual learners might encounter when learning the language. So my goal in this course and in this video in particular is to help you to start to think about language from this metaphor, to start to see the water that's in the fishbowl, so that you can start to really intentionally plan for language. So again, language objectives are answering this question: what is the language that students need to learn or use to be able to accomplish the content goals of the lesson? So how will students be using language so that they can engage with the content learning? And I always break up language into these two components, language functions and language forms. I think this is a helpful way to think about language objectives. So the first question is, what is the purpose of language use in this lesson? How are students using language? Are they justifying? Are they explaining, narrating, informing, retelling, describing, persuading, comparing, sequencing, predicting? There's a lot of different ways that we use language to accomplish something. So thinking carefully about how are students using language? What is the purpose of language? And then after that, thinking about the specific language that students will need in the lesson. And that's what I refer to as the language forms. So that might be vocabulary, but it also could be comparative adjectives, longer than and shorter than, causal language like because, since, as a result, past tense verbs. There you see geographic vocabulary, language of discussion. So the words that we need to use, the types of phrases we use when we're having a discussion. So what are the specific forms that language takes in order to accomplish that function that ultimately helps students engage with the content learning? So functions and forms are a useful way to think about writing language objectives. And when you're thinking about forms, here's another metaphor. You can tell that I enjoy metaphors. Another metaphor that I find helpful is Dutron Moran's metaphor of brick and mortar words. They talk about brick words as kind of like the vocabulary words, like the big words that students will need to learn so that they can engage with the content. And then mortar is all of those other words that help put those brick words together that students also need to know, but we might not pay as much attention to. And I like to extend this metaphor to also think about, like, what are we constructing? You know, are we building a school, or are we building an office building? And we're going to be constructing the language differently depending upon what the ultimate goal is, whether we're writing a persuasive piece versus a report. So kind of thinking about language forms in this way, I think, is helpful. So we can break it up maybe and then into the word level forms, the sentence level forms, and the discourse level forms. So we might think about everyday language that students need to know to be able to engage with the lesson, cross-disciplinary language that goes across different content areas, or technical language that's specific to the content that we're teaching. So here's some examples. See would be everyday language. Observe would be something you might use across different content areas, but is more of a word that you encounter more at school than outside of school. And then magnetism, very specific, probably a word in a science lesson. Moving into sentence level, we could think about grammatical complexity. So what types of sentences students are being asked to produce or engage with in reading, grammatical structures, verb tenses, pronouns. So that's all the ways that language is being put together at the sentence level. And then we have the discourse level, which is how texts are organized, how dense they are. So if we're organizing a text, the persuasive text with our opinion, reasons, and evidence, if we're using cohesive devices to connect ideas, how dense the language is, how many clauses and adjectives that we're putting into the sentence. So this just gives you a vision of the broad scope of language forms that we might be thinking about as we're planning our language objectives at the word level, the sentence level, and the discourse level. And now we move to a template that I've developed over the years that I think will hopefully help you, especially if you're new to language objectives, to begin to construct some language objectives of your own that are useful for your planning and your instruction. And this is the template. It's not the only way to do a language objective, but it's the way that I found helpful in my work with teachers. And it is, students will be able to language function, content topic, using language forms in whatever the language domain is. So for example, so the questions framing these are, how are students using language in this lesson? So that's the function. What will that language look or sound like? Those are the specific forms. And then domain refers to reading, writing, speaking, or listening. So what is the main focus of language for this particular objective? So here's an example now. Students will be able to discuss characteristics of polygons. There's my content connection. Using comparative language, such as both blank and blank have blank. And I always like to give some examples of what the forms might look like in parentheses, just to give, for my own planning, to give myself an idea of where I'm heading in the lesson. What I share with students might not include the examples, but I find it to be a helpful tool for planning. And then in the domain, in speaking. So students are doing this orally. So this gives you a sense of how you can use the template to put together a language objective. All right, so now I want to walk you through an example of how I would begin with my content objective. And obviously before that, I would have looked at my standard, my content standard and my language standards to help me think about this. But I just want to walk you through with just the objectives, how I can start to plan my language objective for a lesson. So this is a third grade science example with a content objective. Students would be able to describe the process of photosynthesis. So we need a language objective that helps get at what students are being asked to do with content and the language that I want them to be developing as a result of the lesson. So the activity that I might focus on to teach students the process of photosynthesis is having students create a diagram of that process and then also write an accompanying explanation of the different components of the process of photosynthesis. And I want to point out here that this activity is not the content or the language objective. Sometimes when I work with teachers, the objectives end up being the activity or the task itself, but not the content goal or the language learning goal. So the activity is what they're doing so that they can master the content objective and language objective that you've set. So this is the activity that is being done with this group of students. All right, so to write our language objective, we begin with the function. So what is the function of language? How are they using language? So again, they're describing the process of photosynthesis, they're creating this diagram, and then they're writing an explanation. So I would say that the function is probably to explain. They're using language to explain how something happens. All right, so once I've got that set, now I need to think about the specific forms that students will need to be able to accomplish to meet the content goal and engage with this task or the activity that I've planned. And I like to sometimes think about this question: what kind of language do I want students to produce? Or if I was focusing on students reading something, what kind of language are they reading and what might be challenging? In this case, they're going to be writing an explanation. So what might that look like? And so I might look at some examples of published explanations, and you can see these different, I see the vocabulary they need to learn. When I look at this written example, I see the way that it's organized sequentially. I can see that there's terminology given and then an explanation that follows. So I might identify different aspects of language I could focus on for this lesson. And again, I also could use this exercise of thinking about language from this building metaphor. What are the words and phrases? What are the sentence level forms? And what are the discourse level forms? So there's clearly some terminology students need to know to be able to engage with the content learning, photosynthesis, carbon dioxide, glucose. In terms of sentence level, to write an explanation of how photosynthesis happens, they'll probably use present tense verbs. They might be defining some key terms with relative clauses. Like in that example, it said by osmosis, which lets water pass through the membranes. So definitions are kind of following after the words. They're writing an explanation. So that's the genre. They're using sequencing language. So mapping this out helps me to think about all the different ways I'm asking students to use language to be able to engage with the content goal and also engage with the activity of this lesson. Now, I might focus on any one of these things, but all of this would be way too much for one objective. So as the teacher, you need to think about what is the most important language that I want them to focus on for this lesson, or what is the language that they really need, or the language that would be the most useful, especially for my multilingual learners, for us to focus on. So I decided after creating this list that the most important for me would be that sequencing language and also the technical vocabulary. And so my language objective ended up being students will be able to explain the process of photosynthesis using sequencing language such as first, next, then, and technical vocabulary like carbon dioxide, oxygen, and chlorophyll in writing. So you can see all of those different components from the language objective template and organized there. All right. And this is just an aside. We're not getting into this component today, but one reason we write language objectives is because it also helps you as the teacher to plan scaffolds and supports. So if I know that this is what I'm focusing on in terms of language, I want them to understand how to sequence their ideas, and I want them to be able to use and understand this technical vocabulary. I might create anchor charts that model the process and have some of that vocabulary embedded. We might have a word wall with some of the key terms, maybe with some pictures that they develop. We might deconstruct a text, looking for sequencing language, looking at how writers introduce key vocabulary. And we might have a graphic organizer that helps students to practice using the sequencing words and putting the steps of photosynthesis in order. So the language objective helps me to think also about the scaffolds that I'm going to use to support students in mastering the language and content learning goals. All right, so in summary, some characteristics of effective language objectives are they're measurable and observable. So similar to content objectives, we want to be able to actually observe students engaging in the language objective. And even for a reading objective or a listening objective, we can observe if a student can identify something after having read a text. So we can look at their comprehension. Or a listening objective might involve students following written or following oral directions. I can observe if they were able to follow those directions to accomplish some task, right? So any objective we're writing, regardless of the domain of language we're focusing on, should be measurable or observable. It should align with content objectives. So there should be this symbiotic relationship between the content focus and then the language focus for the unit or the lessons. It's designed with your emergent bilingual students in mind specifically, and we want to think about what kind of language supports and goals would be the most useful for your multilingual students. And it focuses on portable language that serves students in other contexts. I love this word, the portable language, because the idea is that there will be times we want to specifically focus on like targeted vocabulary for that lesson, but we also should think more broadly about language that we could focus on that might be useful in other content areas or for other lessons. So if students are learning comparative language so that they can compare triangles, that comparative language might also be helpful when they're comparing two different events that happened in their social studies lesson. So thinking about what are some features of language we can focus on or some forms that we can focus on that might be useful in other contexts as well. All right. And I'm leaving you some resources in Brightspace to help you as you begin to write language objectives for your unit. One is a summary handout that has a lot of the information I just went through about what language and content objectives are, and then how to write a language objective. And the other is a great word bank that has examples of language functions, language forms at the different levels, and then some examples down below of what these some sample language objectives for what this might look like for a word level focus, a sentence level focus, and a discourse level focus. So I hope these resources are helpful as you begin drafting your language objectives. And I wish you well as you begin that process.